Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our weekly congressional chats. Forgive me for being so informal, but Congress isn't in session today. We've had a long and surprisingly productive week. But let's talk about the three big issues I think that the American people are focused on, that Congress is focused on, frankly, that Oklahomans are focused on. I had a town hall meeting, a teletown hall meeting this week, and the issues that came up were exactly the same ones that you read about in the newspapers and you hear about all across the country. The first is Ukraine. This has been another extraordinary week of unprecedented, unprovoked Russian aggression against a smaller democratic neighbor. I think all America has been moved by the heroism of the Ukrainians. I've been astonished by the European response, which has been robust and united. You've got countries stepping forward to help Ukraine that in the past, honestly, weren't particularly leaders. I think of the Balkan countries who are right next door to Russia and border Russia are very small, can easily be overrun. They've courageously sent arms to help the Ukrainians. I think of our traditional allies like the United Kingdom and France who've leaned forward. Even have when Vladimir Putin was rattling the nuclear saber, so to speak, France's President Macron saying, well, you know, we're a nuclear power too, meaning NATO and France, which of course is a nuclear power. And that's quite a pushback. And then I think probably most importantly, Germany. This sort of gets lost in the news, but the Germans have been understandably cautious given the history of their country since 1945. And to see them suspend the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which means the cost of energy in Germany will go higher, and they will be less dependent on Russian gas. That was a huge move. They too have sent arms. This is unprecedented for them to send arms to a war zone, and they've pledged to meet immediately the 2% of their gross national product commitment to their defense. They do about 1.1% now, so this is basically like doubling the German defense budget in response to this. And Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world. This is a really significant pushback. And of course, the United States has continued to provide arms at an unprecedented level. Congress earlier this week actually voted for over $13 billion worth of aid to Ukraine, everything from armaments to humanitarian relief. And it's actually split between the two, about half and half. This is a story that changes day to day, but there's not much doubt that the Russian military is engaged in war crimes. I think the global response has been pretty sobering to Russia. We still don't know how this will end. No question the Ukrainians are overmatched. One area I do differ with the administration on is the administration initially signaled that it would be okay with Poland sending aircraft, MiGs really, Russian-built aircraft to Ukraine. The Ukrainians know how to fly those planes. They don't know how to fly ours. And then about 24 hours later, that stand was reversed. I think that's a mistake. We ought to be willing to give the Ukrainians any kind of arms that they ask for, short of nuclear weapons. And maybe we are. I mean, the reality is, while we might saying we're not, you know, I would not be shocked, although I certainly don't know this, if some way we found a way to get aircraft there. And I certainly understand not flying aircraft directly into a war zone from a United States military facility in Germany, but hopefully some way we can help the Ukrainians. They deserve it. Again, they didn't start this conflict. They've asked for the help. They're not asking for Americans to fly the planes. They're asking, give us the planes. We've got the pilots, and help keep us in the air so we can protect ourselves against these Russian airstrikes. So I think we're going to continue to monitor this, but I think the sanctions routine has gotten heavier. You notice both the president issued an executive order. Congress actually passed through the House some restrictions on importing Russian oil. I don't think they're robust enough, but they're at least a step in the right direction. And so let's build on what we've got. I think you see American companies, one by one, pulling out of Russia. everything from major oil companies like ExxonMobil that are pretty critical in the development of Russian oil to McDonald's and companies that, and some of our major banks as well. So these are impressive sanctions, and they're not enough to do the job in and of itself, but they're important. And I think it's important that the Chinese, who have their own territorial ambitions in the Pacific, are watching this united response to aggression. So we're going to continue to lean forward there. I think all Americans are on the same side. It's actually been heartening. While there's certainly some partisan sniping back and forth and finger pointing, the reality is Democrats and Republicans on Ukraine relief and arming Ukraine have been pretty much united, and we're going to continue to do that. The second big story of the week is inflation. And boy, did I hear about it on my town hall meeting, teletown hall meeting earlier this week. But everybody that's watching this knows this. I mean, look at the price of gasoline at the pump. Look at the cost of food when you go to the grocery store. And when I talk to businesses and they tell me what the cost of raw materials are versus last year, inflation's raging. If you listen to the administration, they'll try and tell you, well, this is because of either supply chain problems related to COVID, or it's because of Putin and the war. Those factors contribute, but the biggest single factor is overspending by the federal government. The Biden administration, against the advice of a lot of economists, made the decision to push for the so-called American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion of spending that honestly we didn't need to make. And they were warned at the time, if you do this, and they did it with no Republican support, it'll kick off inflation. And it wasn't just Republicans that said that. One of the leading critics of the American Rescue Plan is a guy named Larry Summers. Larry Summers may be a familiar name to a lot of you. He was Secretary of the Treasury under President Bill Clinton. He's the past president of Harvard, and he's one of the most famous economists in the United States. And obviously, he's a strong Democrat. But he warned the Biden administration, if you pursue the policies that you're pursuing, that's going to hurt things. And it wasn't just the spending, it was things like canceling the Keystone Pipeline, like limiting drilling and exploration on federal lands, and deciding not to permit other pipelines, not just the Keystone. Those things, frankly, made us more dependent on foreign oil, and they increased the price of energy. That was happening long before the Ukraine war broke out. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has added fuel to that fire, there's no question, but it was bad policy by the Biden administration and the Democratic Congress that ignited the flames of inflation, and they're not going away anytime soon. You're going to see the Federal Reserve, which also, by the way, contributed to this by printing too much money, start to raise interest rates. We already see that people's wages are not keeping up with prices. And while we had a bad month this month, 7.9% inflation year over year, that's the worst in 40 years. My guess is March will be worse because of all these oil shocks that we've had in the last couple of weeks. And again, gasoline went up about 50 cents in a period of about 4 days. That matters to working men and women all over the country. So again, we're doing everything we can to force the Biden administration to pursue less reckless policies. But it's pretty embarrassing when you watch an administration go beg Iran, the largest sponsor of state terrorism, to pump more oil, or sends a delegation to Venezuela, where the socialist dictatorship is so brutal that 4 or 5 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee their country. Instead, the president and the Democrats need to focus on the American energy industry and send people to Houston and to Oklahoma City and to Dallas and to Cheyenne and to Louisiana to talk to, and Mississippi to talk to our friends that drill in the Gulf. And we can deal with our shortages by just ramping up American production to where it used to be, and frankly going beyond that. But again, this administration has done exactly the opposite, and Americans are paying for it at the pump. More important, the world is less secure, and you see the Russians using their enormous exports to punish people that are helping the innocent victims of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Let's move to the third thing now, and this is actually somewhat more hopeful. Congress did pass, both the House and the Senate, what's called an omnibus appropriation bill. We're 5 months late in that, and we're late because Democrats wasted a lot of time in the Senate pursuing things like Build Back Better or what's called H.R. 1 or the voting rights issue. Now, we've talked about them in the past, but they were dead ends, and instead of doing the basic work, they waited around many months. And the House actually had passed quite a few of the appropriations bills as early as last August, but then the Senate couldn't seem to get anything done. But the bills that were passed last August were passed without any Republican support. And to get a final bill across the line in both the House and the Senate, Democrats needed Republican votes. And Republicans basically laid out a list of 4 demands. We did this months ago and said these are the things that are going to happen to actually fund the government other than on a temporary basis. The first is defense spending is going to have to go up. The president's original proposal was to increase defense spending by 1.7%. That's an inflation-adjusted cut. We got that up substantially. It was more than tripled, and $29 billion added to the defense budget. That's an enormous move in the right direction. So in the end, the Democrats caved on defense, and Republicans won that point. The second thing we said is that domestic spending is going to have to come down. The Democrats increased non-military spending by 17% in their budget. We weren't able to get it down as far as I would have liked, but we got it down to 6.7%. So we cut it by roughly 2/3. I think that was a big win, and again, very important. Now, within that, there were certainly some worthy projects. We'll talk about some of those things in a minute, but the point is, they didn't come anywhere close to spending it. As a matter of fact, the spending increase in the federal budget is actually less than inflation and the non-defense side. So I count that as something of a win, although we need to do better going forward in restraining government spending. The third thing we told our Democratic friends is they put a lot of what we would call poison pills, a lot of things related to the Green New Deal, make energy more expensive, a lot of things, labor regulations and things that we thought would hurt the economy. And you're not supposed to, to put policy riders on appropriations bills as a rule. It's certainly not unless there's agreement by both parties. And we were able to get all that garbage out of the appropriations bills. Took a while. It's like weeding the garden a little bit, but we got the weeds out, and the flowers look a lot better for that. The final thing was personally very important to me, and that was to get the so-called Hyde Hyde Amendment restored. The Hyde Amendment is basically a group of 17 different pieces of language that prevent the federal government from funding abortion, except in the cases of rape, incest, and life of the mother. Democrats took all those pro-life protections out. Protections, by the way, that in many cases were added by Democratic Congresses. The original Hyde Amendment was in 1976. Henry Hyde was a member of Congress from Illinois. He's since deceased. I had the privilege of serving with him. But there were only 140 odd Republicans when he passed it, so it was very bipartisan. Lots of Democrats supported it. Over the years, Democrats have abandoned the pro-life position. Republicans, if anything, have probably become stronger on the issue. So this was a bone of contention. We told the Democrats early, if you take these things out of the appropriations bill, there won't be a single Republican vote. When I offered an amendment to put them back in, every single Republican member of the House of Representatives, that's over 210 members, co-sponsored that legislation. And again, we drew the line in the sand and said, until Hyde comes back in, you're not going to be successful in passing legislation. And in the end, we won that fight. It's a big victory. And it's not only did we get Hyde back in, but the Democrats had to vote for Hyde again. and put their fingerprints on it, so to speak. So I consider that a big win. So even though the Democrats control the presidency, the House, and the Senate, Republicans, by being united and refusing to yield, were able to get some pretty significant wins. There were also a lot of wins in there for Oklahoma. You can go to our website and we put out statements on that, everything from highway projects to additional funding for the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation, for the University of Oklahoma Children's Hospital. I'm very proud of that. Additional money spent at Tinker Air Force Base, additional money spent on modernizing our field artillery, and a lot of that money is expended at Elgin, where the final modernization of each artillery piece is done. So again, lots of wins for Oklahoma, additional money for Norman Regional Hospital, money for the Ardmore Air Industrial Park, money in Lawton for what's called FISTA, which is a private-public partnership to encourage defense contractors to locate in Lawton and near Fort Sill. So we were pretty aggressive in advancing Oklahoma interests, and I'm proud of what we were able to get done. Like all appropriations bills, this one isn't perfect. I can give you a long list of things I don't like about it, but it's a compromise. And again, at the end of the day, we cut the amount of domestic spending Democrats wanted to do. We increased defense spending, which we know is necessary in a dangerous world. We protected life by restoring the Hyde Amendments, and we kept most of, really all of the Green New Deal provisions that they were trying to attach to the normal appropriations bill out. So I'm pretty proud of the job that we've done, and to get those things, sometimes you have to agree to vote for some things that you're less happy about, but the point is we got it done, and we have certainty in government funding. We're not looking at a government shutdown anytime soon. So I'm proud of that. Now we need to get to work on the next budget and see if we can do even better in cutting spending domestically, but also maintaining a robust military going forward, and also, again, always to preserve the pro-life protections that are built into appropriations bills. Let me make a last point, and that is to also point that, this was a big bipartisan deal. It took Republicans and Democrats to get things across the line. That's not an easy process this day. There is a lot of partisanship, a lot of polarization on both sides. But at the end of the day, we're stronger when we work together. And we've seen a little bit more of that in the last couple of weeks. Mentioned, I think in a previous session, we had a major postal reform bill passed through the House. The Senate passed that this week. It will go to the president's desk. It's a big deal in a rural district like mine. You have to have the post office, particularly in smaller communities. And we have a major postal training facility in Norman. We also had a very important piece of legislation on sexual harassment signed, where both sides, we had some of the most conservative Republicans working with some of the most liberal Democrats. It was almost comical to watch it on the floor because these are people that never agree on anything. But we passed legislation to say if you have to sign an agreement, an arbitration agreement to get a job, that if you're the victim of sexual harassment, you can decide whatever that agreement says. If you want to go to court, if you want it to be more public, you have that privilege. If you choose not to and you want to do the arbitration, then that's your choice too. But we shouldn't be silencing victims of sexual harassment. They ought to have the ability to go to court and make their case and bring the perpetrators of harassment to judgment. That's actually something that at the end of the day, we found conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats agreed on some major change in the law. So those are three instances really in the last few weeks of Congress finding common ground. How often we can do that, I don't know, but we're going to keep trying to do it when we can, because the reality is while the Democrats have control of the three levers of legislative power, the presidency, the Senate, and the House, the margins are so narrow in the House and the Senate that a few defections, and if Republicans unified, we're in a position to extract concessions and work together. Now, we can either be unrelentingly hostile and gum up the works, or we can be tough and negotiate and try to come to common ground that works to the advantage of the American people. In the case of postal reform, sexual harassment, and the funding of the government, we did come to agreements. We did work together, and I'm pleased with that. I'll be pleased more if in the years ahead, Republicans are in an even stronger position, and I think we'll do a good job. So please continue to stay in touch with our office. We appreciate any communication that you have for us by mail, by call, or by personal visit. Washington is not quite back to normal, but it's better. We have a lot more people coming into the office. Had the opportunities to meet in recent days with Oklahoma bankers, with Farm Credit, with very good groups of people, individuals coming up here. So enjoy that. And obviously, we've had the opportunity to reach out to our constituents with a teletown hall and with more and more visits around the district as we put COVID in the rearview mirror. So good luck. God bless you and your families, and look forward to visiting with you next week.